Hi, my name is Lynn Pratt, and thank you for joining me for this painting. For this one, I am doing an antique baseball glove with a ball in the mitt, and I'm starting with a wet into wet wash for the background. I kind of switch it up on different paintings depending on what the painting is, the complexity of the background or the image, whether I start with the background first and put it in the beginning so that I have a nice outline to go by for my painting, or if I start with my image and do my background last, because this one's just going to be a really simple one color background, just a gray, real simple. I'm going to start with this first and just get it all in so that then I can just continue on and base my edges on how dark my background is and things like that. So I'm going to do it as a wet into wet wash because we'll see if I can get it in with just one wash of color how I want it, or if quite possibly have to go back and do more washes of color as I go. But I have a better chance of getting it how I want if I wet the background first and then just add it all in. It's also a pretty simple shape. Besides one little area that comes in here. So I will switch out my brush when I come into this area and just use this little brush so I can get around these couple shapes that I need to. But besides that, the rest of the outline is really basic. So I'll do everything with a big brush except this one little area right there. So I've got my wet in, and now I am just doing a wash of quinacridone red mixed with shadow green. It gives me just a nice neutral gray. I can tone it the tiniest bit towards the red, or it can get completely neutral gray. I really like these two colors mixed together. You can get it super, super dark as a black, or just have different varying degrees of gray, but it's a really easy mixture to control and keep mixing up, so I really enjoy using it. You can see that as I'm putting it in, since it's wet into wet, it does mix on its own quite a bit easier, and I will just use this little brush for this area. I'm not doing my background completely black. I am leaving it a little bit gray, and then I can put in my shadow around the glove later so that can get a little bit darker, give it more of a three-dimensional look when I put that darker shadow in. I also like this mixture because it does not, it's not too granulating, so you can get a pretty smooth wash of gray, and it takes quite a bit for it to get shiny. A lot of times if you're trying to get a deep dark black, before you achieve that black, your wash gets really shiny. And I like this mixture because as long as you do it in layers, it's pretty easy to keep it from getting that shiny, opaque look. You can get a nice transparent looking black with it. So just trying to move along fairly quickly, going right over my shadow area, getting this all in while the paper is still wet. I can still tilt it just a little bit. I do all of my paintings on like a background of gator board. And I staple them down, and then that way as I'm painting I can tilt my paper around as I need to get my colors to mix as I want them to, or my background, things like this when I'm doing a wet into wet wash. But I really like being able to tilt my paper and move it around as I'm going. I find that much easier so that I can get my brush at the optimal angle so I'm not reaching around funny with my brush. So now that whole background is in. It's not all exactly the same color, which I'm okay with. I want it to change just a little bit, which is nice. And then I'll sit that down and let it dry and then go back and put my shadow in as my next step. While I have that background wash in and it's drying, I am just adding a light wash of quinacridone red to the background of some of the darker parts of the baseball glove. I like sometimes if there's a lot of red or pink or something like that, almost as an undertone in the glove. I really like just adding a wash of that color in first. Because I am using all transparent colors instead of opaque or gouache, that pink shines through and it really just brightens up the painting. You can't always tell, but sometimes you really can. It just shines through those other colors and just keeps it nice and light, gives it a nice tone to it. So I'm just adding a light wash of that quinacridone to some of the areas of the glove that get a little bit darker, that are that dark gold color, goldish brown, and I think it just adds a nice extra effect to it as it comes through that color. I am using all Holbein watercolors. I really like them. They stay creamy a really long time, so you can keep going back and re-wetting on your palette and on your painting. So I really like that about them. This quinacridone red is one of the colors I've recently discovered and just love. So I've been kind of incorporating it a lot more into different paintings. I find I have not used opera because it is a fugitive color, but I do find that this color is very similar, this quinacridone rose, in its brightness and transparency. However, it is a permanent color, so you don't have to worry about your painting fading with it over time. So just getting these initial washes in, and I don't have to worry about the edges too much because it is going to be just an underlayer of color. Much darker colors are going to go over it, so you're never going to see an edge coming through or anything like that. I'm only putting it under the much darker areas of the glove, not the whole thing. I'm just blending the edges with a slightly damp brush and some water. My background's not 100% dry, so I want to be careful how close to that edge I get. I don't want it to bleed into my background. And I'll just put a little bit more down here. And I think that'll be good. So I think that's good for now for my underlayer. I'll let that dry a little bit before moving on. For my baseball, I'm going to do another wet into wet wash for the background color. A big part of this painting is how the light hits this baseball, so I want to make sure that I have it the perfect tones and colors and things like that to really make it shine and pop out and look like a three-dimensional ball is very important. So I have to know that my light is coming from this direction onto my painting. So the shadows need to curve so that the ball looks round. And there also will be a dark shadow at the bottom. So I'm using a mixture of Gamboge Nova and Scarlet Lake to just get that initial pink wash or tannish pink hue to the baseball. I have my laces drawn in really well with pencil, darker than I normally do because I know that I'm going to be putting quite a bit of different washes on the baseball. So I want to make sure that I don't lose those laces by the end of it. So I've just got some color on there, but I want to make sure as it's turning the corner or as it's going in the round that the edges look like they're going away, which means that it has to be darkened on the edge. So as I go around, it's much easier to just flip my paper as I'm going. And then I'm using the same mixture, that Gamboge Nova and Scarlet Lake, and I've just added either some Hooker's green or shadow green into that mixture to darken it and get this nice brown color that's the shadowed parts of the baseball and really make it look like it's starting to turn the corner there. Now this baseball is also an old beat up baseball, so that makes it a lot easier to paint because I'm not worried quite so much that it's a completely smooth wash, and in fact want it to almost not be a completely smooth wash because it's pretty old and beat up. And I'll add the big shadow on the ball towards the end, but just want to get all these beat up scuff marks in it and things like this while it's still wet. Makes it a lot easier. But I want to be careful that I don't take it too far in the beginning because I do want that to be the darker. I want the light part of it to really pop out. Get some shadow going where those laces make them look a little more three-dimensional. But I want to keep in mind I just really want this center area to pop where the light hits right on there. So I'll leave that alone for now and definitely come back to it, adding more texture and things like that as I go. Now I'm just doing a couple wet into wet washes. So I've already wet just the thumb of my painting, and I'm doing wet into wet and making sure that I leave where my highlights on the glove are completely white, and I've wet right over my initial pink that I've put on here. I am using, this is burnt sienna, and you can see how that pink just shines through there and just really makes it so vibrant. So I'm making sure to leave no color on the areas that have the highlights going through, and then just letting this naturally mix and flow through on the rest, and it gives that nice feeling of the old leather. Sometimes just coming in with a dry brush and keeping it out of the areas I don't want it to go into. I'm using some Quin Gold as well on these brighter areas. Not too much, just a little bit. And where it gets a little bit darker, I've got my burnt umber going around. Now I'll add details later, so I'm not overly concerned with getting everything perfect. on this initial wash. I'm really just getting those main colors in and getting that look where it's really just that shiny leather with a reflection. I really don't want the yellow of the Quin Gold, but when it's in the mixture of color, it just really makes it glow. So that's really what I'm looking for by using that. Same with the burnt sienna. It's such a bright, vibrant, nice color. And there's some leather that goes across here, some wrinkles in the old glove. So just being careful to preserve my highlighted parts while I'm doing these initial washes, because I'm definitely going to come in with more color later. And I just do it one finger at a time on the glove. Getting those nice rich tones where I want them. And I'll definitely come back and do more at future steps. But I'm basically going to do this same thing on each of the different fingers in the glove and also on the palm, main part of the glove, and get all those colors in to start. Come in with a slightly damp brush, make sure I'm not putting too much in some places. Now the colors I'm using, most of them you can lift as well. They're really good lifting colors, so I know that going in. One of the things I love about watercolor is that you can skip around. So instead of just waiting for it to dry, I can just skip around to another area that's not touching where I've just worked on and make sure that the water, when I'm doing a wet into wet wash, as long as I'm careful where that initial wash goes, the water's only going to go where I've already wet. So if I haven't wet another area, you don't have to be overly concerned about it flowing into that area because it's not wet. The water, it won't go where there's no water. So a lot of people say, oh my gosh, it's watercolor, how do you control it? But the secret is you just have to be really careful where you wet. So when you're doing these washes, even though it's a large general wash, as long as you don't wet other parts of the paper, you really don't have to worry about it. And it stays right where you want it. Of course, that takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of doing, just like anything else that you want to get good at. But for the most part, not always, but usually you can have it pretty controlled. I'm using these same colors that I did on the first, just adding a little bit of that quinacridone gold in to kind of make it shine there. Now, quinacridone gold will not lift easily, so when you're using that, you just have to be aware that where you're using it, you are not going to be able to lift it easily. Where burnt sienna and burnt umber is not as much, but definitely burnt sienna lifts really easily. So there's a lot of creases in the glove that I'm going to lift out later, and I don't have to worry about that with those. I don't have to paint around them, things like that, because I know I'm just going to be able to lift them out later. So I'm getting these darks where I want them, knowing that I am going to come in and put more in later. I don't have to get it all in now, but whatever I can in the wet into wet wash, it makes it nicer to do first, and then you don't have to worry as much about the paint seeping into each other and later trying to get a smooth edge when you add a smaller wash. So now I've done here, so I have to wait for these to dry, then I can do the middle fingers, and then once that dries, I can do that bottom edge. But while this is drying, I can come over and do this part, and then I can do this part. So you skip around so you're not waiting for something to dry the whole time. Wrapping around, I'm adding the color into the bottom portion of the glove. And again, I've wet it already, so I know exactly where my paint's going to go because it's right into the wet area. And of course, I just stuck my hand right into the other wet part on my painting, which if you are a new painter and you do that and you think, oh, just know that it doesn't really matter how long you've been painting for. You're always going to stick your hand into the wet paint on your glove, on your painting. It's just something that's always going to happen, no matter how long you paint for. That doesn't get any easier. So I'm making sure to just keep an edge there. And still just using these same base 3 colors to do this. Leaving my highlight areas bare. I'm going to put in a lot more detail into the creases in the leather and things like that once it's dry. So really the most important part in this step is just making sure you're leaving those highlighted areas. Now you can always go back and lift out later, but of course if you can get it in the first time the right way, the minimal amount of lifting and working the paper, the better off you are. Getting in some of those darks right from the beginning here, because they are a little bit darker. I'm using the same darks that I used on my baseball. So I try to keep my colors basically the same throughout a painting and not vary too much as I go along so that everything kind of flows and works together. For the main parts of the glove, I have sped this up so you're not just watching me slowly do the same thing again and again. But all of these washes are wet into wet, adding the same colors that I did in the beginning, and just making sure I'm leaving where my highlights are and going darker where shadows are or darker creases in the glove. But remembering that these are just the first washes to get the main overall shape of the glove in, and we're going to be lifting highlights and adding details and shadows and things like that later. So this is just wet into wet for those first main large areas. So everything up until this point of this painting was essentially a wet into wet wash. So just because you want to paint details or in a very photorealistic fashion, it doesn't mean that the whole painting is done with a tiny little brush. Most of my painting starts and is done with these large wet into wet washes that get the base of my color on my painting, and then I come back and add smaller details and things like that and touch up and lift out of the wet into wet and things like that. But the base painting really is started out with all just large washes to get my initial colors in, to get my basic shapes in, and really get a feel for the painting, get all the right colors in the right places. And then I come in with a much smaller brush and add more of the details, put in the laces on the baseball, put in the leather, and things like that. But I really like doing those big first washes, and getting everything in kind of sets the stage for where I want everything to go. And I also know if I have any issues with my overall composition, because if I get all those main basic shapes in and my painting doesn't work as a composition, I know at that point that no matter what I do or how careful I am or how precise I am putting details in, it's just not going to work as a painting, even though it might have looked great as a photo on my computer that I was editing. Sometimes you get it onto a piece of paper and it just doesn't look right. And sometimes you just have to be like, all right, this one might just not work. And that happens from time to time. I know a lot of people think that once you paint all the time, you don't have any mess ups and things like that. Well, you definitely do. You might be a little bit better at saving them and not having a total scrap painting, but it does not mean that you don't get to a certain point sometimes and thinks, well, so much for this one, and you just turn your paper over and you start again. It's a good thing about having some nice, good quality paper, because you can always use the backs, and I often do use the backs of my paper, especially during class demos and things like that. I really like just using all the different pieces, all the parts of the paper. If I've just done a demo on it or something quick and I'm not going to do anything with the painting, I often use the back for something else, even if it's just scrap paper or paper to give a class to use. I don't like wasting the paper. It's definitely expensive, so I like having it, reusing different pieces of it for sure. So now I'm just adding some of the texture into this bottom leather, where the stitches, where it's a little bit cracked and faded maybe. And still just using these same brown colors that I started with. I like keeping things the same throughout. This painting is only 8 by 10, so with the amount of detail, if I was painting this same painting much larger, I would obviously put a lot more detail into the same areas. But because this is only an 8 by 10 painting, some of these little cracks and things like that, and the roughness of it does not have to be as specific as it would if my painting was much larger. So keep that in mind when you're first starting out. It's a lot easier to start smaller and work big, get to a point where you can work big. Even if you do the same painting small, then do it again large, and slowly add more and more detail to it. But it's hard to just start big right in the beginning. It can be daunting by trying to put in all that detail all at once. So here I'm just using dry brush technique and just adding, this isn't going to be the focal part of my painting, so I don't want to attract too much attention there, and add in all that detail to it. And this is just some of this super old glove with the stuffing coming out, so just kind of breaking down here. So I'm just getting some of those details in without adding too much detail to it. If that makes sense. I don't want it to be the focal point of my glove, but I do want to get across that it's older and ripped, kind of tattered a little bit. Just getting all those details in. Get a nice, just that neutral black color that I've been using to add some more just shadow and things to these laces. Making sure I know what's wet, so when I'm adding details in, even though I am using a drier brush, I don't want to go right next to something and have it all bleed into each other. So you just want to make sure you're working on the right things at the right times. Getting those details in. This kind of part is just the stuffing of the glove all kind of falling apart because it's so old. I love going to antique stores and photographing stuff. That's where I find a lot of my inspiration. I just go, sometimes I buy the object, sometimes I just take a picture of it. If the lighting's good, I just take a picture of it right there in the store. I have a couple favorite places that I go, and I buy stuff enough from them that they don't mind that I just come in and take pictures from time to time. But I really like painting old, antique sort of stuff that has rough textures and things like that. So that's definitely my favorite sort of thing to paint. Get some of this stuffing in there. And I'll add texture to that again once it dries. Lift out just a little bit of that. Now these metal buckles have a blue reflection to them. They're metal, so, and it's like a dark metal rivet almost. So I'm putting the blue down first, and then I'll add the darker to it, but then that way where I'm leaving my highlights is that blue reflected metal look. So again, something where I'm putting this underlayer down first because I want it to reflect back up through my other layer. And let that dry first before I add the darker metal to it. So now I'm going to start lifting a few areas. I use a different brush when I'm lifting. It's a little bit firmer than the brush that I normally use. And that gives me a really nice lifted out area. So I'm going to just lift out some of these marks in the leather, some of the creases in the old leather. There's quite a few of them as I go through. So I'm not going to show me going through and lifting every single area, but I'll just skip around, go through my painting, and lift out some of those areas that either my paint flowed a little too far in, or I want a cut in the leather because it's wrinkled. There's quite a few of them all over because it's a super old glove. So when I was doing my initial washes, I was making sure that the colors I was using that I knew were lifting colors. So if I had used some different colors, they might not have lifted as easily. So when you're planning your painting in the beginning stages, you want to make sure that you know what your technique is. Are you going to mask areas off first so that you keep those highlights? Are you going to paint around them with all of your washes? Or are you going to make sure that you're using colors that you know you can go back and lift? So like I said, I know that the quinacridone gold does not lift as well. So anywhere I had that, I know that that color is not going to lift out as easily as my burnt sienna or my ultramarine blue. So as I'm going through, I'm keeping in mind that if I'm lifting where that is, it's going to lift almost to the yellow and not back towards the white of the paper. So I'm lifting first, and then I will go in and add some of the darker areas around this and add some shadows to it and things like that. So it's multiple steps to go through, but I like doing the lifting first, and then I'll go in and add the darker spots after. Now it's important you put the water down on the paper and that you're not scrubbing at your paper. You don't want to dry brush and scrub. You'll just ruin the surface of the paper. So you want to make sure that you're just gently going over it with water. And if you did not get as much lifted as you want, you go back and lift that at another time after it dries a little bit. So you don't want to just keep scrubbing and scrubbing at something all at the same time. You want to let it dry if you're not lifting as much as you want to completely, and then go back and lift more afterwards. Okay, so that's a good start for this point. And now I'm going to go in and I'm going to add some of those darker areas next to my wrinkles. And you'll see all of a sudden they really start to look like wrinkles in the glove with the darker areas around them. You're not just lifting the area, you're going back and you're adding some more depth and detail to them and really making them look old and tattered, adding that detail to the glove. So now I'm just hopping around and adding some texture and things like that to different areas, making sure everything has the right colors to it. There's some areas that I did not fill in with my initial washes because they were just a little bit different. So I'll go in and fill those areas in now. Go in and add, but you can see the difference. Instead of just a lifted area, by adding some of that dry brush texture, all of a sudden it looks like a crack in the glove. But it takes practice and doing it a couple times, of course, and playing around with the colors that you're using, and being comfortable with those. You know, everybody likes different brands of paint. I use basically all Holbein, and part of that reason is because I've just used it for so long, and it is a very good paint, but I've also used it for so long that I know exactly how it's going to react when I'm mixing two colors or putting two things together, that I know how it's going to work. So if you're trying new paint colors, don't get discouraged right away, whether it's a different brand or just a different color that you haven't used. Some are granulating, some are different. They all work differently. So just keep in mind that sometimes there's a little bit of a learning curve when you're trying something new. Sometimes I'll do a painting once and I'll do the painting again, and I'll kind of use a totally different grouping of colors for it. And I find that it comes out completely different, obviously, but I like how some colors work together or not how other colors work together. So just something you want to keep in mind if you're trying a painting. If you have a painting fail, it might not necessarily be your technique, it could just be the colors that you're using or the combination of colors that you're using. So once I start to put these darker shadows in, you'll really see that the glove will start to look a lot more three-dimensional and really pop. It's kind of nice. So I'm just going to keep going through and adding these shadowed and darker areas. Stuck my hand in my paint again. this is the deepest, darkest shadow on the painting, so I want to make sure I get it in here right. But it's the shadow of the ball on the glove. And it's the first step to really making that ball pop out and be the focal point and look three-dimensional. Adding this darker shadow. And I'll move a little bit. It's not going to be perfectly even because the leather of the glove is not perfectly even. We can go through and keep adding these darker areas. Combination of just dry brush over everything. Adding all these marks that are in my leather. Now most of the places where I did one wet wash, wet into another wet into wet wash, was because there was a natural wrinkle or something like that in the glove that was there. So it just made a natural point to stop that wet into wet wash where I wouldn't end up having a big crease through a big area. So it makes it a lot easier to split up your painting that way. Now again, you want to keep in mind how much detail you're putting in depending on the size of your painting. So this is again an 8 by 10 painting, which is a much smaller painting than I usually do. So I like putting a lot of detail in. That's what I really like doing in all of my paintings. So I have to be careful when I'm doing a smaller painting that I don't overdo it and just add so much detail that it doesn't look right. Too many creases, too many areas like that where the painting then is too detailed for the size and you it's almost too much to look at. So you want to add some detail to it without going too overboard and people looking at it and almost just being like, whoa, too much. So it's finding that nice balance. And it's easy to bring things up kind of all at the same time. So instead of finishing one finger all at once, I'll skip around from spot to spot, and that way I won't overdo one spot and then have to bring everything else up to that level. So it's easier to do it this way, kind of separately. And I'm just using my photo, my reference photo. Just keep glancing back at it and seeing what's dark, what's light, where there's shadows and things like that. So you always want to make sure that you have a really good photo that you've started with, because if your photo doesn't have those things in it, it's going to be really hard to paint it. So if you have a photo that is not bright, does not have light and shadow, it's going to make a boring painting. Lots of people send me images and say, oh, you should paint this. But even though it's a neat photo and the photo is interesting, it does not always translate into an interesting painting because there's not enough contrast and shadows and things that make the painting itself interesting. In a photo it seems to work, but not in a painting. For whatever reason, it makes a boring painting. I mentioned I had some blue reflected light, so I'm using that ultramarine blue in a light wash and just putting that into some of these reflected areas of highlight. Gives them that shine and that look. It was only in a couple areas. You don't want to overdo it. But some of them definitely did have that blue reflection to them. Again, I don't want to go too crazy with it, but it was in quite a few spots. You don't want to just put it in one spot. You want to make sure it's kind of mixed around in a couple areas. You can always put it in and lift out what you don't like. And then some of the areas that were laces, just kind of putting those in a neutral tone. It's where the edge of the leather stuck up. Kind of just using my palette mud to put those in, because you don't want them to be a bright white line going through your whole painting, where the edges of those leathers show everywhere. Now I'm going to get back to my baseball for a minute and put the shadow on my baseball in. So it goes down and across and over. Pretty sure I drew my line in the beginning and I kind of lost it now. So get that initial shape in. And it didn't have a super hard edge, so once I get it in, I'll kind of blend that edge up a little bit. I can also blend that a little bit more once it dries. But it gets darker as it gets towards the bottom. And again, it's a lot easier because this baseball is so beat up that it does not all have to be perfect. Kind of add that in. Remembering that when you do something wet into wet, it does get a lot lighter when it dries. So you just want to make sure when you're putting that shadow in, you're getting it dark enough so that later when you go back, your whole shadow hasn't gone away. I'm putting a little more of the beat up areas on top of here. And again, I'll do this in multiple layers so that the colors are slightly different and it really has that natural beat up look that a really old used baseball gets. And then my end step with it would be obviously to put in the laces. So that's good enough for now. I probably will soften that shadow a little bit later. Go back and soften the edge of that once it's started to dry more. So putting in some more of the details, just the rest of the leather that I did not do in large wet into wet washes because it was just in much smaller areas. So I'll just go in with a large brush, or a small brush rather, and just get the rest of that leather in there now that the areas around it have dried. There's nothing different about this part than there is about the areas that I put in the wet into wet wash, besides that they're just smaller, and there's no point in doing a large wash in here because they're really easy to get a nice smooth look anyway when you're just putting it in like this. Paint around all the laces. And again, because of the size of this painting, if this was larger, this area would obviously have a lot more detail to it, but it doesn't need to at this size. So I'll just put in a general wash, maybe have it darker along the bottom, just so it still looks like a rounded leather edge as it goes into the laces. Just a beat up little cut out of the lace. And add some more texture to this stuffing area that's kind of just pulling apart. Like the fuzzy underside of the glove. Don't want to draw too much attention to it, just enough to make it look realistic. And I forgot, this is another one of these blue reflected areas. So I'll put that in. Then I can go back and start putting this dark area on these little metal rivets. So this is where, you know, you're getting a lot more detailed in here. Putting the dark areas in. Leaving the areas that are highlighted, and I'll go back and smooth that over in the end so it doesn't stick out quite so much. But these are just like black metal. I have that blue under them. Just kind of blending them together so they stay pretty simple. And I mentioned I was just going to gently go back and just blend the edge of that shadow that I had done. I didn't want it to be quite so hard-edged, so I'll just go in with my lifting brush and just really gently kind of fuzz the edge of that so that that edge shadow is not such a hard line on the baseball. And just with a very small amount of water, going in and making sure that after I blend it a little, you want to make sure to blot it with a paper towel. If you just leave it, if I just blend that edge and get it to look how I want to and leave it, I will end up with a watermark where I've wet it. Whereas if I blot it with a paper towel, I will not get that watermark. So that's important that you go through. Even if I leave it just like this, even though it looks fine, I will end up with a big watermark right there. So I want to make sure that I blot that edge before leaving it alone. And then I'll go in and add the details on my laces. So I'm going to do that with a mixture of Perylene Maroon and Scarlet Lake mixed with some of the initial greens that I've been using. So this is a much more time-consuming thing. You're just going to take that color and put it where you want to, making sure to go over your laces where the color's right. I'll do it in a couple layers to make sure that it gets darker and lighter and gives more of a three-dimensional effect. If you've seen some of my other baseball videos where I'm painting huge baseballs, you'll see that I add a lot of layers of color to the laces to really make them look three-dimensional. But because of the scale of this painting, it's going to be much more basic. You just need to get the laces in there in the right proportions and the right scale and everything like that so that it looks like baseball laces. Whereas if this was a much larger painting, I would need a lot more detail on these laces. Making sure they get darker under the shadow. And I'm still using all the same types of brushes. My Holbein Gold round brushes. I have them in every size they come in, basically. And they are by far my favorite. And they do not break the bank buying them, which is always a great thing as well. You don't want to have to replace a brush after a long time and not be able to afford it. Putting in the crease. Again, I'm not going too crazy with the detail due to the size. And now I'm going to add some of that dirtiness to my ball. And that by adding more towards the top, making it a little rougher, it also gives the baseball more of that 3D effect. Helps give the laces, give that ball really looking round. You want to make sure that you're doing that same texture in the shadow, because obviously even though it's in the shadow, it's still marked up there. A lot of times I like to make a continuous mark on the baseball going from shadow to light. Kind of unifies it a little bit. Again, don't want to go too overboard. can always add a little bit of green because, you know, could get kicked up in the lawn. Now use the same greens that I'm using in my shadows. The green also helps bring out the colors in the glove, so I like that. Or a little bit more of this, too much, peachy color, kind of like it went in the clay dirt. Okay, so I think my baseball's just about done. Now I'm going to go through and add the shadow to the background of the glove. I put that one initial wash on the background, and then I have a shadow that will be on top of it that will really make the glove pop up more and really appear more of like a 3D object. So I'm adding this in, and then at that point I'll decide if I need another wash on my background or if I think it's dark enough as it is. But putting this shadow in, of course I want to get it all in nicely in one wash. If I didn't have a background in already, I would not have been able to get it so dark. And then I'll come in and add, there's a couple more spots that have the shadow over here. And you can't tell as much the difference between the shadow here and the shadow on the glove. It kind of all just runs together a little bit, which is just fine. But to get that dark spot in, and then I can use the same shadow color to darken the shadows on my glove in just those couple spots that there really was a nice dark shadow. There really weren't too many where I would use that dark color, but just to deepen a couple of these shadows and crease lines. Maybe the tiniest bit right at the base of the baseball to really make it pop out from that glove. So that's basically it for the painting. I'm going to go back and put a couple more darker browns in, things like that. Add a little bit more of creases to the baseball, or to the leather, I mean, and a few more details like that. But it's basically the same things that I've been showing you, just adding a few more texture elements and things like that. But there you go, painting a baseball glove with a baseball in it.